Hello, thank you for joining us today. I am Amy Montoya, an archaeological collection specialist at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture within the Archaeological Research Collections Division at the museum. It is my great pleasure to be your host for this online speaker series titled Innovation in Archaeology, hosted by the Archaeological Repository at the museum. This series brings together scholars who are providing alternate perspectives from which to view the past and the present in the American Southwest. Their work is expanding our appreciation of the lives that ancestral people led in this complex and challenging environment, whether by turning a fresh gaze toward museum collections or by offering personal insights into the people behind the ancestral sites as an Indigenous archaeologist. This lecture series is generously sponsored by the Continuous Pathways Foundation. The foundation supports the cultivation and continuation of culture, education, leadership, community and individual wellness, and economic independence for the Pueblo of Powhatan and northern New Mexico region. We are grateful for their support in helping us to provide funds for our speakers, and we ask that you also support their efforts in our community. I would also like to thank and acknowledge Lisa Mendoza, the museum's registrar, for assisting with technical support throughout the speaker series. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and express my gratitude to the Tewa people on which MIAC and the Center for New Mexico Archaeology resides on. I ask you to join with me today in acknowledging and learning more about their community and connections to their ancestral homeland known as Ogopoge. In the spirit of this series focusing on innovation, we at the Archaeological Research Collections are committed to dismantling ongoing legacies of museum colonialism and commit to supporting our local Indigenous communities in the areas of repatriation, cultural preservation and revitalization, and supporting Indigenous archaeologists and scholars. Lastly, a couple of logistical items before we start. The presentation is scheduled for 1 hour with a 45-minute presentation, followed by a 15-minute Q&A section. During the presentation, all audience members will be on listen and view mode only. During the presentation, audience members can submit questions they would like answered during the Q&A section below. I will leave the chat room open in case anyone needs to reach us for technical issues via a private message. Also, we will be recording today's presentation and it will be available on MIAC's YouTube channel. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Louis Borck. Dr. Louis Borck studies the material histories of past peoples in the U.S. Southwest and the Caribbean. He is interested in how social movements and contentious politics shape religion and politics through time, as well as how modern politics and worldviews recreate the histories and ideals of the West in the Indigenous past. During 700 through 1400 AD, the greater American Southwest was an explosive laboratory of social, cultural, and political ideas. As people grappled with how power was controlled and distributed, new notions about community grew from these struggles. It is within these complicated times that revolutions often occur and are almost as frequently lost to the ash heap of history. For this talk, Dr. Borck will explore how archaeologists and historians create history and how that can erase the history of commoners, particularly of their politics and revolutions. He will use 15 years of research in the Gallina region of New Mexico, including a current field school, as a case study to contextualize many of these ideas. So welcome, Dr. Borck, and I'll hand it off to you now.
All right. I think, are you guys seeing the slideshow now?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, perfect. So first off, thank you, Amy, for the wonderful introduction, and obviously thank you to MIAC as well for the invite to talk with everybody today. And also, before I get started, I want to really thank all of my students, both at the university and at the field schools, as well as my collaborators and colleagues all through northern New Mexico. So, especially around Coyote and Gallina and in the Yavis Valley, folks out at on the Santa Fe National Forest, Bureau of Land Management, as well as Hickory Apache tribal lands. And today I'm going to essentially be talking about work that has been ongoing for me for at least a decade in terms of sort of meta-analyses of archaeology in particular, and has led to a couple of other projects. I'm finishing up a work at University of Missouri, starting at New Mexico Highlands University in August as an assistant professor. But I've also am a founding director with a bunch of wonderful founding board members for a nonprofit called the History Underground. And our goal will be at creating scholarships and workshops for bringing in more Black, Indigenous, and other people of color into archaeological discipline, finding financing for them, which is also a portion of what has happened with the Black Trowel Collective microgrants. We've been really looking at ways that we can help people who are financially struggling stay in archaeology and move through. And this all links up really nicely with some of what I'm talking about, because a diversity of backgrounds really leads to a diversity of histories that we see, essentially. Which probably unsurprisingly then leads to this idea or this sort of fundamental idea that some of you may disagree with, and maybe this will come up in the discussions, but essentially that all archaeology is political. There's no apolitical way to construct history. Everything that we do, all the work that we do creating the past, has an impact in some way on the present. And because I'm going to be talking about how archaeology is political and how it has ramifications in the present, it's really kind of a theoretically heavy topic. But I don't want to sit here and smash you guys over the head like SpongeBob is doing to archaeology students, because that's not enjoyable. I try to make it a little bit more lighthearted. If for no other reason than because archaeologists are particularly well known for being bad at casual conversations. We get lost in the details. If any of you are here as spouses or partners of someone who's really interested in archaeology and you're just casually interested, and you've made the mistake of asking an archaeologist about their research, you may know exactly how poor we are at casual conversations. So I'll try to keep it a little bit lighthearted because it is a really dense and serious topic, so it'll help us move through it, I think. And to get there, I'm going to start with a joke. So do you know how you can tell that archaeologists are greedy? Because we want archaic and to eat it too. All right. So I hope, or I can promise that there's not going to be any formal bad jokes like that again through the rest of the talk. But I am going to try to leverage some lightheartedness to get into some really difficult topics. Most importantly, this topic that really small, or this idea that really small decisions in the past can have massive ramifications in the present. This idea that someone in the past really liked Greece, and I think by the end of this talk, you'll see that there's this long-term domino effect where there has been a massive erasure of successful political and revolutionary moments within indigenous societies in the Americas. And so to kind of frame this, I'm going to start with a really old meme that's been going around the various meme networks for at least a decade, probably longer. I think this was even being shared during the old fax networks that people used to share jokes on, right? And this is the idea, or the, this kind of curiosity about why the US railroad gauge standardizes 4 feet and 8.5 inches. And it's clearly not simply an issue of like a weird transition from inches into metrics, because in metrics it's 143.51 centimeters. Okay, so why such an odd number? Well, it's this odd number because England was actually ahead of the US in building trains and railroad equipment. And that's the distance, the space between the tracks as they were built in England, right? And so England would send over engineers. They were sending over equipment that we're using in the US at the beginning. But why did they build them that way in England? Well, they built them that way because the folks who started to build the railroads were using the same equipment and spacing for their tools, for their jigs, as they'd used to build, and these are engineers, the earlier wooden wagons. So the railroad track spacing is based on the spacing between the wagon wheels because of this kind of technological borrowing. But why were the wagons, why did they have that odd wheel spacing? Right, well, the idea then is that the wagon wheels actually needed to be spaced that far apart, so they wouldn't break on these old rutted long distance roads in England, because the ruts were spaced a certain distance apart and had been used for a long time. But why were the ruts that far apart then, right? Well, the roads actually originated with the imperial Roman legions who were sent out to colonize the indigenous folks throughout Europe. So the original ruts were actually formed by Roman war chariots as well as support wagons, right? And Imperial Rome is really well known for standardizing a lot. They're standardizing their camps, their military technology. So all the war chariots had really similar wheel spacing. Okay, but why were the wheels spaced in that format? The wheels are spaced that way because they're just wide enough to fit the back end of 2 war horses, okay? So the 4-foot, 8.5-inch railroad width that really kind of drives the current US modern transportation system is, the argument is that it's directly a product of the width of 2 horses' backsides from ancient Rome, right? Well, what the heck, Lewis? What does this have to do with anything that you're talking about, with anything in terms of construction of history? Well, first, that whole story isn't exactly accurate. And if you really want to dig into it, Snopes actually has a really great breakdown because it's been something that's been getting shared for so long. And in reality, the US chose that standard that England was using because of issues like essentially arising from the Civil War. But the whole kind of process follows more or less the way that story goes for why England ended up with that kind of standardized rail spacing. But the point of this is that just like how English rails ended up becoming spaced because of the distance of the width of 2 horses' behinds, archaeology actually originated with some horses' backsides as well. And not all archaeologists might agree with me on this, but I think the idea here, I know the idea here, is that archaeology has a specific origin story problem, right? It was very much a tool of a colonial process. And what is this colonial process? And I'll get into that, or how is archaeology used by that? Well, racial issues were definitely wrapped up into it. And it's really wrapped up into this idea of what is civilized and what is civilization. And so all of this stuff really originates in research and interest in these sort of high societies, quote unquote, high societies in and around the Mediterranean, Sumer, Egypt, Greece, Rome, right? And so this idea is essentially based on, civilization is essentially based on this idea of urbanization, city. Civilis in Latin, civis, city or citizen. Medina, which is wrapped up in this idea of civilization, also means city. Politismos in Greek. It's all kind of wrapped up together. And so our earlier ideas about civilization, and these continue. These are still ideas that we talk about what a civilization is. It's also wrapped up with our ideas about what states are, right? Modern states that led into nation states. Civilization is urban, right? Civilizations have high culture, things like writing, monumental buildings, and art. They've got elites. They have politics that transcend individual cities or individual polities. And of course, they've got agriculture. They're settled. They're not moving around. They're not mobile groups. That's all. These are all sort of these underlying ideas that anthropologists and archaeologists and historians and sociologists have sort of put into this package in terms of how we define civilization. And a lot of this really came up earliest in work in France during the Enlightenment, during the 1600s to 1700s. By the time it got into English, it was with this guy, Adam Ferguson, in this essay on the history of civil society. And that was written in 1767, where he wrote not only the individual advances from infancy to manhood, but the species itself from rudeness to civilization, right? So civilization is being set up as a counterpoint to savagery, to primitivism, essentially to things that don't look like the current European, at that time, current European political system, which people in Europe, the elites and the intellectuals, considered themselves to be the inheritors of this culturally superior political process that originated in the Mediterranean. They didn't see the descendants of these people necessarily as them. And this really was wrapped up in a lot of the contestation of who could claim Rome after the fall of that empire. But they're looking to groups around and in the Mediterranean for examples of cultural apexes. So they used these groups to define what civilization is, right? And then they use this implicitly, sometimes explicitly, to help justify the European colonial project, right? Not just in the Americas, obviously, globally. So invasion, land theft, genocide, slavery. And the whole idea of what was civilized and what wasn't was really leveraged to support European superiority. And that really arose from this interest in the past, from history, and then eventually in archaeology. This was eventually contested, and not necessarily in a good way, but people in France started to look at this idea that civilized was potentially problematic. And these earlier versions of society, quote unquote earlier versions, or these contemporaneous versions, which were organized differently as something we might say now, were different, were better. People were inherently good and they didn't need laws and things like that to make them act morally. And in some ways, both the earlier form of where, civilization was better and this kind of non-state level political organization was worse, was less than, is implicit in some ways in archaeology. It's this progressive trope still today. And still we can see this sort of more romantic view where we look at the Paleolithic. This is the period before people were settled and before they had pottery globally. And we often talk about it, we being archaeologists broadly, as having no or limited hierarchy because we don't really see a lot of evidence of inequality. The reality is it probably existed. In fact, people like Dave Graeber and Dave Wengrow have talked about this very eloquently. Eventually, German philosophers merged these two approaches that one saw civilization as better, one saw, the antithesis of civilization as better. So folks like Herder and Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, they all kind of believe that cultures are natural, like not civilizations, but just groups of people. They're like natural organisms. They're not defined by rationality. They're not making specific, purposeful choices. They're just sort of going along. Things are happening. Things are emerging. Civilization, however, is rational and deliberative. People are making specific choices to do and to implement certain things. But they didn't necessarily see civilization as good this non-civilized or cultural sphere as bad. In fact, they often saw civilization as leading to some form of moral conflict. But it's this mix then that we're getting, right? But it's still this problem where they're seeing one type of group, which modeled contemporary European societies as purposeful. It's people making choices about their lives. And another one where people are just sort of going along. They're changing based on everything around them, but not by making any specific choices. And then we sort of brought all this into archaeology and anthropology and history and sociology. This gentleman, Morgan, did quite a bit of it. And we started to create these boxes. This is really referencing the cardboard boxes that I'm talking about in the title, all right? And anthropology and archaeology is specifically within anthropology within the Americas, because in the Americas, archaeologists primarily study folks that they're not descended from. And that's kind of a project of anthropology, at least early anthropologists. Whereas outside of the US and North America and South America, archaeologists are often either on their own or associated with humanities or history departments. But we get to this thing that's very progressive. People are seeing movement. There's implicit value judgments here from band all the way up through state, or egalitarian through ranked and stratified and state with freed. This idea of the urban revolution that Child had Urbanization, right? That's part of civilization. That's good. This previous non-urbanized thing is kind of implicitly seen as people not being progressive, as it not being good. This gentleman, Pyotr Kropotkin, is a Russian geographer, one of the founders of the discipline of cultural geography. And he actually wrote a lot about how these types of research projects replicate within the community outside of the academy, right? Teachers promote this because it's partially a product of state building, of cultural nationhood. So education within and under the state essentially permanently impacts the way that we view the world. So people start to see this type of progression as positive, right? Civilization, states as the height of human political achievement. And this has impacts, right? So this is a quote from Charles Darwin from his journal in the book Voyage of the Beagle. So I'm going to read it here quick. The perfect equality among the individuals composing the Fuegian tribes must for a long time retard their civilization. As we see those animals whose instinct compels them to live in society and obey a chief are most capable of improvement, so it is with mankind. In Tierra del Fuego, until some chief shall arise with power sufficient to secure any acquired advantage, such as the domesticated animals, it seems scarcely possible that the political state of the country can be improved. Right, that's pretty blunt, right? Darwin's arguing that egalitarianism and equity are demonstrably problematic in improving people's lives, that you need hierarchy, you need inequality for that to happen. And Darwin's early arguments were actually contested by that gentleman Kropotkin that I discussed earlier as well, where he was looking at how groups can actually work together. But that's sidetracking and me falling into archaeologists being bad at casual conversations. But I think it's fair to say, and I think every or most archaeologists that are listening to this right now would agree with me when I say that most archaeologists now distance themselves from these ideas of political progress. But I think it's also very important for us to recognize that even though we think they're problematic, they're embedded still within our discipline. Unescapably so if you're not also aware of them and constantly working to avoid some of the issues that arise because of that. Many of our textbooks, especially our world archaeology textbooks, are structured in this way. Our course sequences at universities are structured this way. When we give talks, oftentimes, because of how we've created cultural sequences, we communicate that to you guys. I'll get to that in a little bit as well, to non-archaeologists. And this has spread then, obviously, just like what Kropotkin was saying, through society. Because archaeology and history and anthropology and sociology are embedded within our educational system, research arises from them that goes out to the public, and it kind of creates this sort of never-ending sequence where we see a certain type of political system, like a state or a hierarchical civilization, and it falling apart as negative, right? Jared Diamond, everyone likes to hate on Jared Diamond. I don't actually hate him in the same way a lot of other archaeologists do. But this is a really good example of a very well-known book about how advanced, quote unquote, advanced, these kind of state or state-like social systems fall apart, according to Jared, at least. So you get all these terms. And we've got, I shouldn't say millions, that's hyperbolic at minimum, but we've got a lot of terms for that are essentially positive, classic period, civilization, state, things like that. And then we have a lot of even more negative terms for things moving away from that. Regression, dissolution, devolution, unstructured collapse, post-classic, that's one of my favorite ones. Like we have all these terms that are essentially saying this, what has come afterwards that doesn't increase these levels of hierarchy, is not as good as what came before. Okay, and so this is something that this wonderful woman, Chandra Mahatni, has talked about, right? So this is all wrapped up in what we're learning in school, you know, all the way up from kindergarten through PhDs. So we all carry around everything that we're learning outside of school into school, and everything we learn into school, we take outside of school, and it all acts as a backdrop to how we discuss the present. And the present, for archaeologists and historians and anthropologists and people concerned about the past, acts as a backdrop for how we frame and think about the past, right? It's this big cycle. So I want you to go on a thought exercise with me to kind of frame this process. And of course, my pal Jack Lane here. Okay, so imagine that Jack likes American football, and he was studying American football under the tutelage of the anthropologist Franz Boas. Okay, now Jack defined all of American football's major attributes and postulated that because it allowed a sequence of changes, or because it followed a sequence of changes, the transition in American football really looks like progress. It gets better through time. Next, because anthropology is comparative, Jack goes out to study other sports and other cultures' sports. Boas thinks this is a great idea. Thanks, Boas. So Jack studies sports like rugby, all right? Well, rugby is interesting because it looks a lot like football, right? They got the same ball. They're not really wearing pads. That's problematic. They're using the field in similar ways. They're not tackling right. They haven't quite gotten to the advanced level that American football has. He also goes out and he studies cricket. Well, cricket's, they've got a ball, but it's not the same type of ball. They're using a stick, but there's no stick in American football. They've got these weird goalpost things. It's not quite the same. The field's totally wrong. In American football, it goes both ways. They've just got like kind of circular or one directional. They've got pads and helmets. That's kind of right, but they're shaped wrong. There doesn't seem to be any tackling. And then he gets to lacrosse. And lacrosse starts to ring some bells like rugby did, right? Also, unlike rugby, it was formed in the Americas. But their modern rugby or modern lacrosse is using some pads in similar ways to football. Again, they've got this stick thing. The ball doesn't quite fit right. They've got a field that they're using in really similar ways to American football. Yeah, Jack can see how it fits in this sequence. And then he studies Formula One racing. And Jack's at a loss, right? He's not even sure that this is a sport. There's no ball. He's not quite sure how the field's used, in terms of what this, I'm not sure. Jack is confused about Formula One racing as to whether it's a sport. It might just be ritual or very ineffective but performative transportation. So Jack goes back to his advisor and tells him what he's found. So he kind of ranks sports in order of evolution and the relationship to evolution towards American football, right? Rugby is the closest, then lacrosse, then cricket. And then he gets to this last oddity, this thing that he found, this ineffective form of transportation called Formula One. He just doesn't know, it doesn't make sense. It's not a sport. It doesn't fit anywhere on this spectrum. And that's basically, and I hope with Jack staring at us, a wonderful analogy for how the short and long of archaeology and anthropology and even history and sociology, and how our definitions of what are cities and civilizations and states all having emerged from and being focused on these cultures and these societies with specific historical attributes in and around the Mediterranean is problematic when we export that outside of the Mediterranean, right? Anything that looks different is almost always going to be bound to look less than because we're essentially always going to be evaluating other societies based on these things. We're always going to be evaluating rugby or Formula One racing or cricket based on American football, right? So how can anything different but fail to fall short, right? And I tell my students this all the time, that even these really basic things like definitions that archaeologists use, our cardboard boxes that we create to make these foundations to build arguments on, are hypotheses. These aren't settled. We have to ask ourselves what's included to make these definitions. And even more importantly, we have to ask ourselves what isn't included. Because in this particular case, these ideas of what is civilization, this implicit idea of what this progress of civilization, of progress of society, the peak of nationhood, what this looks like is really based on excluding a lot of different types of global political and cultural groups. And all of these definitions are culturally informed, they're culturally created. Definitions like this are political animals as well, which is one of the many reasons that archaeology is always political. So what's that mean for things like post-classic periods and dissolutions and regressions and collapses, right? Well, if civilization, if this kind of progressive arc that archaeologists contest that they still use progressiveness, and we've moved on to things like complex societies, which really is just a more complicated way of talking about essentially a linear progression with dips and stretches and strains and movements in different directions. But if civilization is urban, and if civilization is aggregating, and if civilization is rational, then all of these things like digression or dissolution, collapse, things like deurbanization and deaggregation, they're going to necessarily be seen, even if it's just implicitly, as non-rational, as non-deliberate. They're going to be seen as collapses, right? Even if they're purposeful degrowth episodes. So they're also potentially going to be seen as the only approach to social crisis and thus not deliberative. And I'll get into that here in a minute. And this whole kind of package, this whole underlying of essentially Western philosophical and historical research and anthropological research that really is packaged within contemporary social sciences is how certain histories become erased. A lot of histories become erased. The two I'm going to be talking about, though, are the histories of societies that don't reflect the European definition of civilization and state, right? Or maybe I should say the Mediterranean and Near Eastern definition of civilization and state. And then, of course, groups that move away from something that looks like this type of definition, because we'll often see those, as I just mentioned, as problematic collapses instead of as purposeful achievements. And so this is where we kind of get into more stuff that I've done. And this is published in a couple of different spots. 2017 had a small version of it with me and Matt Sanger, and then I had an article on it in the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology last year. And there's a special issue of a International Critical Archaeology journal that's basically a discussion forum on my article that should be coming out here in the next couple of weeks. And the idea, there's a whole lot of stuff packaged within this, but the idea is that I was curious, like if we think about what really kind of forms the background and the basis for archaeology, which forms the background, the basis a lot of times for heritage management in the Americas more broadly. What does heritage management look like then? Because what we decide to preserve is a form of erasure, right? The stuff we don't decide to preserve is essentially getting erased. And so I looked at all the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in North America, so Canada, USA, Mexico, and all the Caribbean countries. And the idea, of course, is that if we're expecting that we're making a contrived effort or an intentional effort to actually preserve the broad spectrum of political organizations that we see, or social organizations, if you want to call it that we see in the Americas prior to and even after the colonial, the arrival of Europeans or the invasion of Europeans, you'd expect to see obviously vertical, so places that have inequality and hierarchy, but definitely a lot of horizontal, because there's a ton, especially in North America, there's a ton of social systems created through egalitarian processes. Now, these are generally not either or situations. There's always a hierarchy involved in egalitarian social systems. There's always egalitarianism embedded within vertical social systems, right? That's why we have socialism within a liberal country like the United States, within a capitalist, majoritarian, decision-making democracy. But we can look at these as sort of the major political decision-making process that's happening within these political organizations. And in fact, when we look at World Heritage Sites, most of the ones that are preserved by UNESCO are in fact groups that have heavy levels of inequality, strong hierarchy, and only a few are horizontal. And that's really the exact inverse of what we actually see archaeologically. And my argument for this is that UNESCO is essentially, and a lot of heritage managers are essentially replicating, like what Mahatma and Kropotkin were talking about, replicating their contemporary ideas on what people want to see, what's interesting, into the past. We're erasing these societies, these successful societies that don't look like current societies. And it's not just in, it's not just broadly at this international level that this is happening. We see that in the Southwest as well. These are some tables for that underlie data from an article from 2017, which is actually in Kiva. This is an analysis of publications in Kiva. And then there's an in-prep article that actually is done. I just need to send it out for review. But I went through basically and coded a bunch of different indicators of hierarchy and or egalitarianism, from restriction of religious knowledge to presence of elites and that kind of stuff, and got this sweep where -3 is extreme egalitarianism and 3 is extreme hierarchical. And then I coded for other things here too, you know, the article year, it was published, whether it's an academic researcher or a contract archaeology researcher, what time period, how many views it's had. And something really interesting pops up from this, which is that I'm gonna point you guys down here to the one in the bottom middle, because that's everything. This is over 5 years, it's about 71, it is 71 articles with a couple of like introductions excluded. And this means that all told, this middle thing here is the low to middle to extreme hierarchy takes about societies that have that sort of or vertical political organization are about 71% of the publications in Kiva, right? If we exclude the low hierarchical systems, then we get ones in just the moderate to extreme. It's 53%. That's a lot, right? And if you actually look at the numbers, it's about 2 times as much published research on moderate to extreme hierarchies as there is in extreme egalitarianism to moderate egalitarianism. And that happens with views as well. If you move over to the left, you can see that you get about twice as many people reading the articles on more hierarchical archaeological cultures than less hierarchical archaeological cultures. So this is interesting, right? Up on top, the smaller table on top, is if you actually remove the archaic, this thing that we have problematic processes for pulling apart things like politics and inequality in, and you also remove colonial studies, you end up with something like 94% of the articles published are ones that deal with some form of hierarchy, and 63% deal with moderate to extreme. But this is interesting to me because it means that archaeologists obviously are not, just like heritage managers for UNESCO and working with UNESCO are not immune to this sort of embedded cultural worldview. Archaeologists aren't, right? We find hierarchical societies more interesting. I often do public talks and open and ask people what they think the most interesting Southwestern sites or societies are. And it should be unsurprising to people that Chaco goes ding, Pakime goes ding, and occasionally a classic period in the Hohokam area pops out. Mesa Verde for sure, right? So it's both researchers making decisions as well as the viewership of these articles that's really being impacted by this. Okay, and so then I threw this into a multiple correspondence analysis plot to see how all these variables kind of fall out. And what we really see, excuse me, and this was actually interesting, I thought, was that academics are generally the ones who are pushing the more hierarchical research. And this is, you know, academics who have freedom to essentially work in whatever areas they want to. And in general, it's contract work that's really promoting and publishing on the more egalitarian, the more horizontally oriented political systems. And a lot of that is really embedded in a lot of the federal legislation that we have in the United States. And of course, the interaction with indigenous groups who helped construct some of that legislation. So even though CRM is in a lot of ways working as an entity of the state, because of this comprehensive way that we're trying to manage our heritage, it ends up with them being more likely to be researching egalitarian social systems than academic groups. So that's one way that we erase histories, right? What we choose to research, what we choose to pay attention to, what we choose to preserve, right? That's all kind of reflected in us being interested in things that just look a bit more like what Europeans defined as a civilization, as states. And then there's this other way, those that move away from something that looks like this European defined peak of society, civilizations and states. And that's where we get much more into my recent research in the Gallina region, even in the Hohokam area, because I work in Southern Arizona as well. Excuse me. So as I was saying with that stuff about Kiva, and I want to highlight, this isn't the editors of Kiva's issue. I know a bunch of the editors. This is really just what's being submitted, right? This isn't what the editors are pulling in. It's not Kiva's fault. It's just this kind of aggregate emergent pattern that really reveals sort of these underlying cultural interests. So what we're interested in the Americas conforms an awful lot to what archaeologists and early historians, anthropologists decided to use to define civilization, right? Cliff Palace and Mesa Verde, Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon really represent some of the like physically look like and politically seem to model some of these much more hierarchical state-like processes. And so we, by focusing our research interests on this, we sort of incidentally replicate this idea of progress, right? We're really interested in these things that look like the stuff that other people have decided was the peak. It's this long train of domino effects, I guess. And we see that in how we've actually created cultural sequences in the Southwest. So this is for the ancestral Pueblo region. We moved through from the left, its earliest, or my left at least, I'm not quite sure what it looks like for you guys, from Basket Maker to Pueblo 3, even into Pueblo 4. We moved from these ideas of what isn't civilized, dispersed, non-agricultural, non-sedentary, non-elites, into what is civilized. Large aggregated settlements, cities, urbanization, elites. And this transition, these boxes that we create are, everyone uses them, I use them. We use them to essentially simplify how we're talking about the past, but really it's based on this progressive path. Now, no one is going to agree 100% that that's the way it is, because in fact, a lot of us look at how there are tensions and movements between these. But when we go out, even when we're doing our research, but also when we go out and talk to the public, we're still kind of transmitting this information, right? I mean, like when you look at Pueblo 4, what's happening, the transition from Pueblo 3 to Pueblo 4, as people would talk about in this sequence, is that you actually have a decrease in hierarchy. And I show it down here in this figure that I've constructed by looking at access to religious knowledge through time. This is particularly ancestral Pueblo region, but I've done something similar for Hohokam and Mogollon as well. But this gets back to these things we always have to ask. What's excluded, right? When we're talking about Pueblo 3, we're talking about this kind of heightened hierarchical system with elite, religious specialists who have control in some form or other over the life, at least the political and religious life of a lot of these communities. And that's what a lot of people have talked about, folks trying to get away from when they left the Mesa Verde region around 1300. And the Gallina region just doesn't fit that. So this is in northern New Mexico. Basically, if you draw a triangle between Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and Santa Fe, the Gallina region is smack dab in the middle of it. And it's not small. It's generally ignored in almost every overview of Southwestern archaeology, including in textbooks. It's about 2,000 square kilometers with about 2,500 structural sites. Anyone who works on the Santa Fe National Forest Bureau of Land Management in that region, or works for, lives on or works for the Hickory Apache Historic Preservation Office knows how many sites are out there, right? These sites are anywhere from one habitation structure, one house, to 30. So really we're looking at a minimum of 2,500 houses, that's 2,000 square kilometers, probably closer to about 7,500, 8,000 houses with anywhere from 2 to 4 people living in them. That's a lot of people living there for about 200 to 300 years. And they're just mostly not talked about, except in fairly negative ways. And they're interesting because when you plot them in relationship to how other people from that time period were living, this is, again, in particular, in relationship to access to religious knowledge through looking at specialized religious structures, the Gallina are dramatically different. They don't look anything like these groups. And so I use these as a kind of a learning tool, because I am looking for very specific contexts in which I might be able to find groups that have been doing things deliberately, but have been talked about as not doing them deliberately. Gallina is one of them. So I want to point out, this is not a real magazine cover. People at Archaeology Southwest were really nice. Catherine Bader in particular, they mocked up this cover for me during a special issue that Mike Bremer and I guest edited. And the special, this fake cover, this mock cover, is really poking fun at some of the earlier archaeological conceptions of Gallina folks, that they're psychopathic. Really the term, these are all terms that have been used by archaeologists. They actually said sociopathic, thanks Turner. Violent hillbillies is another one. Archaeologists have also called them backwards, regressive, ignored. This group, this massive amount of people living in the highlands of northern New Mexico, were talked about as essentially rabid hillbillies who couldn't keep up with the rest of social change that was happening politically in the Southwest, right? They're different. And there's two assumptions that arise from our cardboard boxes and progress in state civilization politics that need to be dealt with. First, that movement away from hierarchy, that things that look different than this, if they looked the same before, is collapse. We talked about that already, right? And the second is that folks naturally deconstruct hierarchy and the state during crises. And that this sort of movement away from hierarchy during a crisis isn't deliberative. This is kind of what we're talking about with the early philosophers looking at ideas of civilization. But that's not even remotely the case. You can study, social scientists study crises and social reorganizations, environmental, political crises globally through time. And people have two dramatic paths that they can take, right? They can either go towards a more horizontal or egalitarian approach, or they can go towards a more vertical or hierarchical approach. They can resolve crises in either directions, or attempt to resolve them in either directions. So there's nothing in a crisis event that would argue against maintaining or increasing hierarchy. In fact, a lot of times the only reason we talk about these sort of deconstructions as people rejecting hierarchy is because the reorganization was so dramatic. But oftentimes people double down on these collapses. In the Gallina region, you see some really interesting patterns happening. Right, through time, no one was really living in that area. There's a lot of people living in these dispersed habitation settlements. They're not living in pueblos. They're living in individual households. And there's a ton of people living in the Chacoan region and the Mesa Verde region to the, and of course in the Santa Fe region to the northwest, southeast, and southwest of the Gallina region, right? But the Gallina folks, they never really pick up on the Pueblo stuff. They don't, when they move into this highland region at about 1100, as hierarchy is really upticking through the Chacoan to Mesa Verde power transition, they don't bring all of that with them. There's a lot of stuff as they move into these highlands that they leave behind. And this really gets to this idea that Donna Haraway talks about, which is that technology is never neutral. So everything that we're looking at as archaeologists is helping to make the people that we're studying. It's helping to make their cultural process, their cultural pattern. And everything that these people are doing and thinking is making their technology as well. This is a very, also I think, indigenous viewpoint, which I'll talk a little bit later with some quotes by Swenson. So we're really connected through each other and our technology. In the Gallina region, then what this means is that their difference, we really need to reconceptualize why they're different, not just as incidental or accidental, but potentially almost assuredly as purposeful, right? So this is a figure looking at from a publication a couple years ago, looking at room contiguity indexes. And it's a pretty good way to look at both how adjoined, how Pueblo-like or apartment-like a site is, as well as to also kind of understand some ideas about management of construction of these sites. But you can see for the Pueblo 3, so lower down on 2, they're really contiguous. Up on 4, they're very dispersed, individual houses. And you can see the Gallina just don't fit the pattern for pretty much anything happening during the Pueblo period. They really modeled their communities after the Basket Maker 3 stuff. And you see this in other areas during the Pueblo period too. You see it in Taos during the Valdez phase. You see it up around Chimney Rock prior to the Chacoans showing up there. And it's interesting that these don't show up in our cultural sequences, right? Our cultural sequences talk about increasing urbanization and aggregation. The Gallina also get rid of specialized religious structures. A lot of the religious indicators, the traits end up in every single individual structure, both their above ground structures like this unit house, as well as the below ground pit houses. They all have these benches and flagstone floors, really formal hearths. In fact, these houses are the labor sink for what's happening in the Gallina region. People always, one of the reasons they're talked about as ignored or backcountry is because they don't have elites and they don't have elite goods. But I think what they're doing is their households are their elite goods. They're sinking all their labor into these houses. They're about 2 to 4 times the size of houses, including pit houses in other regions. These things are massive and they're hugely overbuilt. We also lose trade with, in ceramics at least, with outside groups. It's another reason that they've been talked about as left behind. So the idea then is that they're excluded. Instead of that, they restricted that access. And so this is work that I've done looking at the presence of foreign ceramics in the Gallina region. And these are almost all curated, which means they're coming from, they're being brought from different regions. Some of them are up to 300 years prior to the inhabitation in the Gallina region. It's one of the reasons that I started to think about what was going on there as a kind of multicultural rejection of what was happening in Mesa Verde and in the Chacoan region, because they're bringing stuff from different areas. They do other things too that we don't always talk about or think about necessarily as necessarily related to hierarchy, but I think corrugated ceramics in particular are something that we may want to think about revisiting. What happens is broadly in the Southwest, corrugated ceramics kick up about 1100, 900, 1000 actually. And by about 1300, they're completely gone, or they've just, the corrugation has just moved up onto the neck. And that essentially happens as people move out of the four corners. They get rid of all of these corrugated pots. In the Gallina region, about 200 to 300 years prior to that, when they moved into that region, and they were seem to have been purposely rejecting a lot of the hierarchical political organization that was happening in other areas, they also got rid of body corrugation. I'm not saying that people looked at these corrugated vessels and said, elites or hierarchy, but there's an interesting correlation that I don't quite understand. I don't think anyone else, at least any archaeologist I know quite understands yet, but there's some sort of contextual indication that there's a linkage with rejecting this as well. So what Gallina folks seem to have done is just gotten rid of a lot of what they saw as problematic social and political processes, right? They removed the ability for people to become political and religious elites by despecializing their architecture, by everyone having access to these religious spaces. And we have essentially missed this because we don't always look at this type of de-aggregation as intentional or as beneficial or as purposeful when we're really focused on this transition from band to state, right? When we're looking at aggregation and at increasing inequality, things like that, as implicitly as positives. So our views of how social change should go can often lead us to miss purposeful rejections of this type of social change. It can lead us to miss revolutions and rebellions. And really, I think it's important to note that the material that highlights this can really give us deep insights into the meaning of the rebellion and its message. In the Gallina region, it really seems to be focused around these houses, and agriculture too, but that's something that I'm still in the process of figuring out. Chandra Mahatni, I'm going back to her again, talks about home not as this comfortable, stable, inherited, and familiar space like we talk about it oftentimes in the United States and more broadly in the quote-unquote West, but as an imaginative, politically charged space where family members and community members engage in the shared collective analysis of social injustice, as well as how to transform society, right? Revolutions may look like they're happening on the streets in Minneapolis or in Portland or in Puerto Rico, but in fact, they're happening in the house. They're happening at home. That's where this conversation is starting. And this really wraps up, I think, really powerfully with something that Rena Swentzel, who's an architectural historian from Santa Clara Pueblo, has written about. And it's one of the reasons that I haven't published on this, but it's one of the reasons I actually think what's happening in the Gallina region is really driven by women, because a lot of the changes that we're seeing happen are oriented around the house, and they're oriented around pottery, things that we see through the archaeological record that are often associated with women in the Southwest. So as Rena says, we're synonymous with and born of the earth. So are we made of the same stuff as our houses. We built them, tasted them, talked with them, climbed on them, lived with them, and watched them die. The entire community was the house. And that's important, I think, because that means these houses are specific choices, right? If the community is the house, that house is a specific choice about how people want to live. And that kind of brings us to the close of this, and this idea about how we're going to break down cardboard boxes. I can't even explain to you how hard it is to find a GIF of cardboard boxes being broken down. This is the closest I could get. So enjoy this tiger tripping on a cardboard box. But the idea that creation of these political categories, these sequences, is usually in a political act, even if it's just implicit. And that has current impacts on global indigenous communities and contemporary understandings of what types of social systems are possible in the present. If we have concerns about the way society is organized, we really are losing alternative ways to organize if we only preserve things that look like contemporary nation states. And these categories that we use in archaeology can often erase histories that don't fit those categories, right? So they're choosing what to put in them. They're also at that same time choosing what not to put in them. And those things they don't put in often get left to the side. And sometimes this is through ignoring them. Oftentimes it's by naturalizing human deliberation and resistance. Right? We erase choice by creating these boxes and understanding movement away from these more hierarchical processes as necessarily, egalitarian or horizontal. And this is my second to last slide, and I want to highlight this because this has real world ramifications, end stop, period, right? These are both comments I've gotten. I have a lot more. If you want to see people very angry, read the comment sections and a lot of the political essays that I do. The one on the left, I anonymized both of them, but the one on the left is from an essay on in the Conversation, also in Yes Magazine, by myself and Shane Miller. And the commenter says, perhaps the most revealing indication of the merits of this is Indigenous folks, particularly Iroquois and O'odham, their moral systems, was the sad fact that their population remained stable for thousands of years. There is no indication that population densities increased in the millennia prior to the arrival of the Europeans. Of course, we don't have much data on that, we do. But what little evidence we do have just doesn't point to any kind of social, economic, or technological progress. The exceptions to this were the three hierarchical cultures, the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Incas. All three show signs of positive development. All right, it's not just me making this story up, right? This is how people are absorbing what archaeologists and historians are doing. This is a more problematic example, but they exist in lots of forms like this. This one on the right is one of the more racist things that people have posted, that anyone's posted on my Facebook page in the last couple of years. And it's problematic. I'm not gonna read the whole thing. And I didn't put all of his notes up here. But the most important thing here is that he says Western man has also granted Native Americans political and legal sovereignty, literal nationhood, in addition to massive subsidies and philanthropy, invitation to open trade, blah, blah, blah. All these other problematic understandings of colonial and indigenous relationships. But I want to focus on this idea that this person thinks that Western groups, colonial groups, gave Native Americans political and legal sovereignty, right? Nationhood. And there's a specific reason for that. And it's because a lot of, as the other person on the left was saying, a lot of Native political organizations, which were incredibly complex, incredibly successful, but just looked like someone was evaluating rugby using traits from Americanist football, weren't considered to be nations, right? So this person thinks because we forced some of these groups into this statehood-like ideal that Westerners had developed based on work in the Caribbean or in the Mediterranean, that we gave them this political and legal sovereignty. And that's a problem. Anyways, thank you all for listening to me. Thanks in particular to the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture for the invite. We're gonna do Q&A now, but if you're interested, you can find out more about my public writings at my website. But more importantly, go to the website on the bottom to read blogs and essays that my students and colleagues have written in relationship to this work.
Okay, great. Thank you, Louis. Okay, so we have a few questions that have come in. So I'm going to start with some of the questions and comments that have come into the chat, and then I'll move to some of the questions that are currently in the Q&A. Okay, so you got some comments coming in first. So from Josh Lennis says, keep up the great work, Dr. B. And then Nancy asks, are people less interested in egalitarian societies because we are not familiar with them and how they work? Can we identify with them, and how would you address that problem?
Yeah, so this is a concern or a question that I've brought up in relationship to the UNESCO stuff as well, because one of the comments in relationship to that was like, oh, well, you end up with a lot of hierarchical societies because a lot of what I also study is decision-making practices, especially in terms of positive and negative benefits, both in terms of horizontal decision-making and vertical decision-making. Quote unquote, I'm falling into a bad casual conversation, right? But one of the things that's I think really interesting is that it is, I think, a problem. I think the reason that folks aren't studying it is because they're not interested in it. I think the reason folks aren't telling me or going out and visiting these things is because they're not interested in them. I think it's the reason they're not getting preserved is because they're not interested in them. And I think it's all kind of wrapped up in this idea that people see this kind of intentionality in progress and in the presence of elites and what they see as more complicated decision-making practices. But if you really look at egalitarian decision-making practices, they're incredibly complicated. They're incredibly complex, not just complicated. And I think that's one of our problems is in archaeology in terms of both getting archaeologists interested as well as the general public. We've done a good job of getting people interested in big buildings, right? And those often go along with hierarchical societies. We haven't done a good job of getting people interested in big public works projects, which often go along with large scale horizontal societies, like the Phoenix canal system that the Autumn really ramped up during the pre-classic, the more egalitarian period prior to the more hierarchical classic period there. And water systems like that really form that. So we need to kind of think more broadly about ways to engage people about some of the positive and more interesting aspects of egalitarian politics. Not just say, ooh, that would be nice to have less inequality, but like look at some of the cool things that arise from this.
Okay, thank you for answering that. Okay, so moving on to questions in the Q&A box. We have a question. So who were the Gallina people before they moved into the highlands? And were they mountain ancestral Puebloans? And what is the relation of Jemez Pueblo people to Gallina? So
Yeah, so the Gallina folks are for sure ancestral Puebloan folks. I shouldn't say for sure. There's a lot of research happening within the Gallina sphere right now, and so a lot of these questions are in process of being looked at still, but they're definitely ancestral Pueblo. There may be some folks that were a part of the Gallina groups that weren't what we consider ancestral Pueblo as archaeologists. But this has to do a lot with understanding of in-group movements of different more mobile groups into the Southwest as well. The relationship to the Jemez people to Gallina. So I didn't bring up any of the oral histories that Jemez have in relationship to Gallina, primarily because, as far as I know, all of the 2 oral histories that I know were not publicly released by Jemez folks. And so I am not sure Jemez folks want us sharing those histories. One was released by a white archaeologist who worked for Jemez, and another one sort of got published by someone, and I think Jemez groups have removed any sort of public accessibility to that. That being said, some archaeologists have pushed for a relationship to Jemez from Gallina. Florence Hawley-Ellis in particular, as well as Roger Green, Jim Mackey, Reggie Wiseman, I think is another one more recently. And it just doesn't seem that that's fundamentally the case. What happens at the end of the Gallina period, based on research that I've done, as well as Lexi O'Donnell and many others, is probably that they dispersed outwards. Work that me and my students are doing in the Gallina region is demonstrating that they're actually there later than we thought. We've got dates that post-date 1300, which we haven't had before. Our latest date was 1275. But I think they're moving into different communities, potentially because there is some conflict with groups moving through that region, so potentially as captives, but also just as they're moving out of this area. See, these types of social movements benefit most when the groups that they're rejecting don't start to look like them. And as people moving out of the Mesa Verde region were rejecting a lot of the inequalities and hierarchical practices and that were embedded up there, it, I think, became more difficult to isolate yourself. I think so people started to disperse out of the highlands, but they weren't really having any issues in terms of maintaining economic surpluses. They were very healthy.
Okay, thank you for answering that. And Marilyn asks, the Amish don't seem rebellious. They just rejected our world and kept to themselves. They have a strong religious center. What do you think of this example?
Yeah, so I've written a book chapter comparing the Gallina to the Amish. And I think you kind of answer your own question, because I agree with you. In a lot of ways, the Amish, when we think about them from our particular point of view, especially if we're thinking about rebellion as like violent uprisings, they don't seem that way. But on the other side, like you said, they rejected X, Y, and Z, right? And the whole Anabaptist movement was really this decentralizing movement that was rejecting hierarchical practices that were happening in the church. It was one of the things they were dealing with. It's why the Amish don't have churches. They move around between individual leaders' houses. So there's a lot of interesting comparisons between the Amish and the Gallina, because they were both undergoing this sort of cultural vitalization effort that also pulled in things that looked older but weren't necessarily older.
Okay, thank you for answering. And next question. Can you say more about how the form of the Gallina house compares to the pet house, unit pueblo, or great house room? And how are they different, and what do you make of that?
Yeah, so the Gallina houses, they're both above ground structures, which are square. I think I actually get my, I have a couple of images. Here's some images on the bottom. Oh, that's upside down and reversed. Not even sure how that happened. But you can see they're both square and circular. The pit houses are circular. The unit houses are square. So the relationship between the structures that you see, other pit houses from other regions, is generally that Gallina structures are much more overbuilt. Almost all of them that have been excavated have these kind of flagstone floors. Their walls are much thicker. In fact, I generally work on looted sites to avoid damaging intact structures and to kind of go through a process of, I don't know, renewal, kind of repair the impact that has happened to these sites. And one of the ones that we're working on in the Aves Valley has a wall that is 1 meter thick. And if you go out to Pueblo Bonito and you get to the back end of Pueblo Bonito where they've got it held up by the giant boards, and you look at the width, the thickness of that, that's supposed to be 4 stories for that great house, potentially 5 stories, I think, in that spot. And that wall that's supporting 4 stories is 1 meter thick. So these folks are putting the type of labor in to these structures that you see in really specialized religious rooms in great houses as well. So internal layout is, they're clearly related to what's happening in terms of their wing walls, in terms of their fire pits, to what's happening in the northern San Juan. But then they also bring in a lot of new introductions that you don't see. And the size is something that I think is growing out of increasing these earlier pit houses that you see in that region. But they're standardized, I should add that. A lot of the internal features you see everywhere. So you notice that this pit house and this unit house have essentially the exact same internal features. But they, you see that over and over. They all have these wing walls, those things coming in with the bins. Here's a better example of that. They all have these banquettes, these benches. They don't all have murals, but they all have these really elaborate hearths that are much more overbuilt than they need to be, basically made out of multiple levels of ash with a middle cap of flagstone as well.
Okay, thank you for answering that.
Yeah.
And Marilyn asks, what are archaeologists doing to fit Göbekli Tepe into their hierarchy, since it is archaic times, I think? They made that monumental architecture apparently a religious center. I have not heard if they are agriculturalists. How is this related to your thesis?
Yeah, so Göbekli Tepe is something I mispronounce all the time, so apologies for that. But this is a really interesting site, and it's like Poverty Point in the Americas in terms of its interest, because it's this really massive site that's built by non-sedentary, non-agriculturalists, something that we don't often talk about as being possible with these more egalitarian, more horizontally structured societies. And one way we do think about it is that it happens through time. It takes a long time to happen. That was our idea for Poverty Point, which is one of the few UNESCO World Heritage Sites from a horizontally organized group. What we found out because of work by T.R. Kidder at Poverty Point is that that was actually built, at least some of the mounds were built over the course of a month. So there's massive organized labor that's happening in these horizontal social systems. If anyone's watched hunting, large-scale hunting practices, they understand this is possible. If anyone's looked at how canals are built and canals are managed, I mean, this is something we see in the contemporary New Mexico, right? This kind of large-scale, heavy undertaking is something that can have a strong hierarchical or non-hierarchical component. Tepe has been, because it didn't fit within this progressive sequence, it's been a favorite for the alien conspiracy folks and the early advanced civilization folks, because they can't see it fitting unless there was some sort of advanced civilization, state like a global civilization. Archaeologists because the critique that I'm leveraging, I'm not the only person doing this, not even remotely. And in fact, this is my comments are really fundamentally underlain by what Indigenous archaeologists are saying, and what African American archaeologists are saying, and what feminist archaeologists and anarchist archaeologists. There's a lot of people looking at stuff in this way, and so there's changing ideas about how societies manage power, essentially. And Tepe is one of these places where it looks like, same thing with Poverty Point, people were managing power by dumping it into this site, and then not having all of their excesses, their labor excesses, their excess goods, be something that is problematic within the social systems outside of it. So Tepe's an amazing site. It's one of the coolest ones out there because it's really indicative of the power of political organization within these horizontal societies.
Okay, thank you. And Santa Fe Advisors, they ask, do you find archaeologists from non-European societies are more or less open to hierarchical societies and perhaps have their own types of boxes?
Yeah. So obviously this depends on what group you're talking with as well, right? There's some non-European, non-Western groups who are highly hierarchical. And so the boxes they create for these kind of looking at changes through time really replicate what Western archaeologists, or how Western archaeologists talk. But in general, especially in North America, this is a large chunk of the book I'm writing. If you've read Nick Estes's book on Lakota history and how, I think the book is titled Our History is the Future, and he's essentially talking about similar ideas, which is this process of contesting hierarchy, this process of tension where you're always aware of who has power and who doesn't have power, and you fight against that power being centralized with people. That's a lot more prominent broadly within North American societies than I think it is in a lot of, in some areas of the world, particularly within Europe in the post-Roman era in particular, but even a lot of the earlier indigenous groups in Europe were very vertically oriented. So yeah, that's a long answer. The short answer is, depending on the group and the history of the group, many of them are very open to this idea.
Okay, we have a comment from Marilyn. She says, thanks, terrific, loved it.
Thanks, Marilyn.
And the next question is, was there overlap with the Navajo, Denata, and Gallina?
Yeah, so geographically, 100%. And you get a lot of Navajo archaeological culture on Gallina sites. In fact, I've got radiocarbon dates out for a hearth that I'm pretty sure is a Navajo hearth that's on a Gallina site. So you do see Navajo ceramics on Gallina sites. Whether there's overlap temporally between Athabascans or Navajo and Gallina is an open question. Most archaeologists would say a firm no, I think. There are Wade Campbell, who's Dene archaeologist at Harvard. Him and I had a conversation about this last summer. He came out and visited us. And I think Tim Wilcox is interested in this topic as well. Tim's Tewa and Dene, I think. And so he's really been looking at the kind of intersections of ceramics in that region. And there's a lot of similarity between plainware Gallina ceramics and Navajo plainware ceramics, particularly in terms of fillet rims. It's like this decorated band of added coil around the rim, a pointed bottom vessel, so they kind of get more conical. And I don't think that whole discussion is closed yet at all. In fact, I said that in a publication in 2017, that I suspect there's a lot more happening out there that we just haven't quite figured out yet.
Okay, thank you for answering that. And Matthew asked, Do you think the collapse of current monuments reflects the demise of hierarchical systems as a counter narrative?
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Matthew. That's a really good question. It's, that's really complicated. Obviously, we won't get into the discussion about the collapse of, or the pulling down monuments. But one of the, I mean, the short answer for that is, yeah, I do think that there's an emergence of people feeling comfortable expressing their concern with these more hierarchical practices, particularly in regards to how history is impressed on marginalized groups. And so it's an empowerment practice that is contesting that kind of hierarchical narrative. In fact, watching people come to grips with how horrible Columbus was, who didn't realize it, has been really empowering over the last 3 years and the last 2 months in particular. And it's something that I think us archaeologists who are in a position to really push these narratives that are ignored should be doing more of.
Okay, thank you for answering that. And Carla asked, can you talk about how you involve local communities in your work?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Carla. So this has been ongoing. This is an ongoing project, and the field work that I'm in the middle of right now has been essentially happening for about 3 summers, right? So the local communities out there are very dispersed in terms of political or cultural origins. Most of the Gallina archaeological sites are managed by folks who aren't traditionally considered descendant community members. So they're on Hickory Apache tribal land. They're on a lot of private and land grant land around or north of primarily Coyote and Gallina, Regina in the Yavis Valley up there. And they're on Bureau of Land Management land and the Santa Fe National Forest. So one thing that I've been doing is working heavily with the Santa Fe National Forest, partially to look at the impact of damaged sites on their forest. And this has transitioned into understanding a really heavily managed agricultural system out there that hasn't been fully recorded yet. So in terms of working with, the landowner community, I guess we're really engaged with the forest to help kind of bring that into play. I just got an email from some of the rangers and archaeologists at the Forest Service about how to work in some public interpretation stuff out at one of the publicly accessible Gallina sites, Rattlesnake Point, which Florence Hawley Ellis, actually John Hayden, who we're looking at one of his wonderful illustrations, had worked at. And so that'll hopefully be a broader project that we can bring in local community members, both in the broader region, as well as more specifically local land grant high school students to help work with setting up this kind of heritage system, I guess. I'm also am in contact with Jeff Blythe at the Hickory Apache tribal lands. Jeff and I have been working together to set up projects that involve helping the TIPO's office get some work done that they need done up in that region. But also, I think the long-term goal is to bring students from Hickory in as well. I've also reached out. Gallina gets a little bit difficult because under NAGPRA, under NAGPRA, there's no community that has claimed affiliation with them. So we don't really have a one-to-one descendant community to reach out to. There's concerns with how archaeologists have treated Jemez as a descendant community. And I think Jemez folks are a little bit leery about working with archaeologists on Gallina stuff. But I've been reaching out over the last couple of years to folks in the Tewa villages, as well as in Jemez and Hopi as well. So more broadly, the goal is to actually get people talking, not necessarily even with me in the room, about what's happening in the Gallina region, and bring in, with the long-term goal of a more comprehensive indigenized management plan for it, while also recognizing that there may be and I think there are very specific reasons that a lot of indigenous communities have distanced themselves from the Gallina region. Jemez in particular has some concerns about what was happening in the Gallina region.
Okay, we have 2 comments. Judy comments, thank you for presenting an alternate view. We tend to see progress as moving towards our predominant values of wealth and power. It's always interesting how we project these values into the past in other societies.
Thank you.
And then Marilyn comments, right on about Columbus. Most people don't know I'm Italian American. I read Rethinking Columbus decades ago and was horrified. Behavior of the time which we must reject, a reason to be anti-hierarchical. Okay, and then another question that we have, do you think Gallina people were literally looking over into Chaco and opting out? And how do they resist assimilation by Chaco?
It's really interesting, the relationship between Gallina and Chaco. And it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not temporally a one-to-one relationship. As things were kind of winding down in Chaco and the center of power was moving up into Aztec and Salmon, and then eventually up into Mesa Verde, it's really post like the height of Chacoan power when you start to see the large-scale, really rapid settlement of people in the Gallina region. So, and it seems to be in relationship to the construction of the Great House out at Chimney Rock. It looks like, and this is work in particular that Eric Chupka and Eric Simpson have done, and really kind of pulled this together. Eric and I then wrote an article looking at this long-term history of resistance to power in the northern San Juan, and how the Gallina are kind of this unsurprising result of that. So this has been happening. People move away from these emerging centers of power all the time. Norm Yaffe always talked about how unstable archaic states were early states because they just couldn't keep people there. There wasn't another state bordering them that would suck those people in or give those people like a just as bad alternative option. So as these archaic states were growing, people left. I'm not sure, I think my whole talk really is highlighting that I'm not sure we should even bother calling Chaco a state. I don't think we should try to justify it along these sort of Western ideals. But I do think that what we're seeing out at Chaco was incredibly hierarchical. And we're seeing people leave that system. You definitely see it in the Kayenta area. If you map out the distribution of great houses, there's just, some areas are just conspicuously absent. This is something that Sev Fowles has talked about for how to look at things in archaeology that aren't there, right? You look for them where they should be, and they're not. In Kayenta, they're conspicuously absent. In Gallina region, a lot of Chacoan stuff is conspicuously absent. Margaret Dew actually did some work in a local journal in Texas, The Artifact, I think, that actually looked at basically like a dead zone, you know, quote unquote, non-settlement zone between Chaco and Gallina. So people were avoiding each other, I think. We don't see resource extraction from the Gallina region into the Chacoan region. The trees they're pulling from are coming from the north, the west, and the south, and not from the east, and where a lot of the Gallina stuff would be. You also, something interesting happens with Aztec and Salmon. Folks from the more Chacoan centric region have interpreted a period of growth within the Aztec and Salmon great house communities, potentially as a reaction to the violent behavior of folks in the Gallina region. I've done a significant amount of research on violence in the Gallina region. Most of it seems to revolve around non-local people moving through the Gallina region instead of them being exterior raiders, basically leaving out. Everything we have about them indicates that they really didn't want to interact with people. And so what this seems to be, instead of folks in Aztec and Salmon building up to be militarily successful against the Gallina, is instead a competing ideological system. And I think what's happening in Aztec and Salmon as they're building up is they're essentially flexing their, cultural power muscles as Gallina is becoming an attractive center for people rejecting these types of world systems, and people are moving into it. Because I do think the northern San Juan, especially folks around Chimney Rock, formed a very solid core of people who moved into the Gallina region. But this kind of curated ceramic evidence and some other technological evidence, including the tri-notched axes, indicate that there's probably people coming in from further abroad. And so there's a larger multicultural component as well. So there's some kind of give and play that's happening as people are contesting these power systems.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, Thomas asks, is there any evidence that any Gallina survived?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think one of the false narratives that has arisen through Gallina archaeology is that there was a genocide out there and all the Gallina were killed. And in fact, in one of the oral traditions, there's a discussion about a massive attack by the Gallina as well as against the Gallina. But we, assuredly we know that, at least in terms of captive taking, that people were probably moving out of that region. That's survival. But almost assuredly, based on material culture that we see throughout the northern Southwest, northern New Mexico, as well as biological evidence. Lexi O'Donnell has done some work with this, as well as James Mackey. We know that they're moving outwards into other communities. And whether they're moving into, whether they're just, if we think about the Gallina region as this discrete little region, and one of my grad students, Nina Taylor, has really just pulled apart some amazing regional separation that's happening within the Gallina region based on decorative attributes. So we know that it's like a multi-political component maybe happening out there as well. But regardless of that, people seem to think that it's a small kind of confined thing, and all the people would have gone to like one area. But there's a lot of people. And so the reality is they probably moved into a bunch of different areas. So I would expect, based on both the biological evidence that we have, the material evidence, as well as just the geographic evidence, that there's probably ancestral folks all throughout the Rio Chama and Rio Grande valleys, if not also further west.
All right, so that's the last of our questions. Those are all really great questions, everybody. So is there anything else, Louis, that you'd like to add before I close?
No, again, just check out my students' work. They've got a lot of really wonderful essays and unessays. So they've got songs and third grade classroom lessons and stuff like that. So they're really the reason that this work has been really productive. And if you see me going out to the field, holler at me because we love to meet up with people out there and give tours.
Sounds great. Maybe we'll hit you up on that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who joined us today. And thank you to all the people who submitted questions and comments tonight. So whether you joined us for your first time today or for the whole series, we at the Archaeological Repository, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Borck, for being a part of this lecture series. We really appreciated it. And please continue to look at MIAC's webpage and Facebook page for upcoming events and the Center for New Mexico Archaeology's page also. So as I said before, if you missed any of the other previous speakers from this series, the presentation will be posted on MIAC's YouTube channel in the following days. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and please stay safe during this time. Goodbye.